Hello, my name is Sydney Fargis. Welcome to Jane Austen's Shelves. I have been a devoted reader of Jane Austen for pretty much my entire life, and this is a presentation aiming to give an introductory exploration of the female authors whose works influenced Jane Austen. This is the first virtual talk I have given for an online conference, but I'm really excited to be presenting to you all. So, a quick word about my background. I specialize in British literature, specifically the Regency and Victorian eras. I have a master's in English literature and have been an educator for nearly 12 years now, most recently at the college level. The slides accompanying this talk are really just meant to provide something visually aesthetic to look at. And all of the images that you'll see in this presentation were taken by me. So several years ago, I was fortunate enough to visit Jane Austen's England. Went to Bath, Chawton Village, Chawton House, the Jane Austen House Museum. So with the exception of some of the book photos that you'll see in this presentation, those I took in the comfort of my own home, the rest of the pictures were taken on my travels. For example, the first picture that you're privy to, the one on the intro slide, is an image of early editions of Austen's works. They were taken at Chawton House. So, little of the origin story of how this kind of presentation idea came to fruition. All of the women authors I'll be discussing with you today, with the exception of Jane Austen, of course, are familiar to me solely because of my undergraduate studies. Honestly, in the bookstores I regularly visit, I have yet to find one of their novels in stock, again, with the exception of Jane Austen. And so, despite the fact that you will hopefully leave this talk today with the understanding that Anne Radcliffe, Frances Burney, Charlotte Lennox, and Maria Edgeworth were writers Austen not only read but aspired to be like, the irony is not lost on me that I encountered these female authoresses because they were baked into a year-long course I took while I was in college, and it was entitled Jane Austen's Novels. The professor incorporated their books into the course reading under the labeling of supplemental materials. And I am a bit ashamed to admit that, barring that year-long course, I pretty much entirely left my copies of their books to collect dust on my bookshelves until I was recently compelled to really get to know them through the research and brilliant delivery of Rebecca Romney. Her publication of Jane Austen's Bookshelf, I have my hand right here, led to both the acquisition of dozens of books on all of the above authors, including Jane Austen, as well as the inspiration for this video. And so these women, Charlotte Lennox, Frances Burney, Anne Radcliffe, Maria Edgeworth, they already had publications in print before Jane Austen ever did. Surviving letters written by Austen and her own novels are proof that she read, admired, even wanted to emulate their style. So why is it then that it's primarily scholars of British literature, experts of the Regency novel, and rare book collectors who are familiar with their works? Why do we routinely return to Austen, but very few of us ever pick up the books of the women Austen considered to be so brilliant? I discovered these female writers because of my love for Jane Austen. I have been a staunch Janeite since I was old enough to be familiar with the term and understand what it meant. In the brief time that we have together today, I really hope to brush the surface and share their significance with you all. These women whose books line Jane Austen's shelves. This photo, this beautiful, stunning piece of photography, is an image of one of the reading rooms in Chawton House. I want to begin with Charlotte Lennox, the author whose name literary scholars do not bring up nearly enough when discussing the inspiration for Northanger Abbey. Hopefully, my presentation does not skip ahead of me. Jump to Burney. Let's see. Okay, so pausing a moment to take a peek at this quote on the screen. This is an excerpt from a letter Jane Austen wrote to her sister Cassandra in 1807. She says, "Female Quixote now makes our evening amusement. To me, a very high one, as I find the work quite equal to what I remembered it. So looking at that kind of clue there, remembered it. This is not the first time that she's read Wixit. This would be a reread, perhaps multiple times over. Now, toggling back to Northanger Abbey, arguably one of the lesser read novels by Jane Austen. Northanger Abbey directly references two of the authors I'll be discussing later in this talk, but it also contains elements notably parallel to the work of a third, Charlotte Lennox. Not likely to be considered a household name. But her novel, The Female Quixote, is a unique take on a very well-known, if perhaps not as well read, it is quite the doorstopper, Don Quixote by Cervantes. It would also appear to have gone on to inspire Austen's novel, Northanger Abbey. So both Northanger Abbey and The Female Quixote center around naive young heroines who adore novels, and Austen's mockery of society's fear over the influence of Gothic romance on the female mind echoes pretty closely Lennox's mockery of society's dread over what might happen if a woman were to read too many chivalric romances. So Austen was not the first woman writer to scoff at the notion that a woman could be harmed by the novels she read, nor was she the first to satirize the idea that a woman wouldn't be able to tell the difference between fiction and reality as a direct result of enjoying the art of novel reading. Due to preserved letters, one we just looked at, we are well aware that Austen read The Female Quixote more than once and that she loved it. But when scholars reference authors who might have inspired Northanger Abbey, it's Anne Radcliffe and Frances Burney whose names come up, not Charlotte Lennox. So why is that? Ultimately, Lennox all but disappeared from the literary canon because her authorship was challenged, and because eminent Victorians, predominantly male, just could not approve of the heroine in The Female Quixote. Arabella, the heroine, simply put, had too much wit about her, feeding into the fear that this might encourage Victorian women to inadvertently disrupt the proper functioning of their minds and bodies, by trying to imitate Lennox's heroine, that it could even lead to infertility. And at the heart of her cancellation, we find someone whom she considered to be a very dear friend, Samuel Johnson, known for a dictionary of the English language. He originally befriended Lennox because he admired her tenacity and felt they faced similar struggles. It was Johnson who encouraged Lennox to pursue the writing project that would essentially initiate her gradual fall from grace, Shakespeare Illustrated. And it would be Johnson's name critics of their time would credit for writing the second to last chapter of The Female Quixote. Even though there was, and still is, no evidence to support this claim. So backing up to the publication that led to critics discrediting her, Lennox wrote a book called Shakespeare Illustrated. And in that book, she critiqued William Shakespeare, a writer all of England had essentially decided was pure genius. As quickly as the public had been besotted with her writing, they turned against her. The literary community dismissed Lennox and Johnson, perhaps because he didn't want to face backlash by standing in support of her, turned away from Lennox along with them. In fact, when just 3 years later, Johnson decided to write a book of his own about Shakespeare, he did not include Lennox's prior work on the Bard in his book proposal. Not long after the Great Shakespeare debacle, rumors began to circulate as to who was actually writing Lennox's works, giving birth to the whispers that it was authors like Johnson playing heavy hands in her most notable of publications. Not until this century, has it ever been acknowledged that Charlotte Lennox would have been the one to influence Samuel Johnson in relation to his work on Shakespeare. And so, with this in mind, we can claim a better understanding as to why the name Charlotte Lennox does not come up when discussing Northanger Abbey. Before we turn to the two women whose names do come up, Frances Burney and Anne Radcliffe, just want to take a moment, recap Lennox's authorship being challenged, Lennox's character due to both the creation of Arabella and also due to the gall that she had to critique Shakespeare led to her cancellation. And so the combination of that challenged authorship and literary cancellation essentially wipes her from the literary canon. Totally unrelated. We have this image of a writing desk that I took in Jane Austen's House Museum, but it is fun to imagine that all of the women writers I'll be discussing in this talk would have had a similar setup or a setup of some sort that would look something like what you see in this photo. So, Frances Burney. She was actually coined the mother of English fiction. So did you know that Virginia Woolf labeled Frances Burney the mother of English fiction? She awarded her this title. Um, I didn't, and I love Woolf. This is another thing that I learned as a result of reading Rebecca Romney's Jane Austen's bookshelf. So on page 40 of Jane Austen's bookshelf, Romney wrote, in Austen's impassioned defense of novels in Northanger Abbey, she named as examples of 3 novels in which the greatest powers of the mind are displayed. Of those 3 novels, 2 were by Burney. So I think it's important to note as well that the first time Austen's name appears in a novel, it appears not in a book written by her, but rather in a book written by Burney. Evelina by Frances Burney was one of Austen's favorite novels. And it is Evelina that Austen's own father compared his daughter's work to when trying to help Austen publish First Impressions, the epistolary novel that would become Pride and Prejudice. It's also worth noting that the initial drafts of 2 of Austen's most popular novels, Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, were written in the style of Evelina, the epistolary style in which the story is delivered through a series of letters. Personally, I find it fascinating that the novels of one of Austen's favorite authors are all too often primarily referenced for the purpose of comparison. Worse, as a watered down Austen. Every single one of Austen's heroines pursue love and happiness while simultaneously learning how to overcome their vulnerable position in society. Vulnerability tied to their economic status, their social standing, and their gender. And it's Burney's fictional works that all center around the necessity of women both discovering their voices and coming to terms with the importance of standing up for themselves when faced with circumstances that are stifling, that Austen would have found admirable. This determination of Burney's to highlight the inner strength of women. And a determination, I might add, that would have been quite bold in light of society's attitude toward women. In Northanger Abbey, Austen views readers of Burney as individuals who have good taste. Again, making it not that much of a stretch to infer that Austen found Burney's writing to be both bold and brilliant. So when in 1814, Burney published what would be her final novel entitled The Wanderer, a book that she spent 14 years writing. Her literary stardom was actually in descent. This was the same year that Austen published Mansfield Park, the same year that Austen's literary stardom was rising. Burney would outlive Austen by 20 years, but Austen would undeniably surpass Burney in the literary. Why? Unlike Charlotte Lennox, society did not attempt to erase Burney, but they did succeed in transforming her legacy into that of an iconic diarist, not an iconic novelist. Over the course of Burney's life, she lived to be quite old at the times, she was 87. Novel reading was increasingly viewed as a means of destroying the eternal soul of a woman. And to be a novel writer, especially a female one, was viewed as disgraceful. In service to King George III and Queen Charlotte, Burney was a dedicated record keeper, a dedicated diarist, and she gradually became known both for her life at court and her life in exile, as opposed to being known for her brilliant fiction. But at least, unlike Radcliffe, who we're about to talk about, Burney was never accused of being insane. She was never labeled as a bad writer. So, recapping here, Burney, with Evelina, rose to tremendous popularity. And her novels, primarily Evelina, would go on to directly impact Austen. We know that Austen read and thoroughly enjoyed Burney's works, particularly Evelina. One of Burney's other novels would actually inspire the title Pride and Prejudice. We know that Burney's determination to encourage women to shed their vulnerability and embrace their inner strength would have been viewed as the opposite of the patriarchy's view of an ideal woman. We would have known, we do know that Austen would have found this viewpoint to be admirable, to be bold. And we know that Burney disappears from the reputation of iconic novelist and reappears into having this reputation for being this iconic diarist, this iconic record keeper. Essentially, we have to come back to this idea of the ideal woman. Who is an ideal woman? Who gets to be called an ideal woman and who does not? So why didn't Austen come under fire? Right? Why is it that Austen does not seem to come under fire in the same ways that Lennox, Burney, and Radcliffe did? While plenty of Janeites do not consider James Edward Austen Leigh's depiction of his aunt to be especially engaging or true to her character, it is actually pretty accurate to say that his memoir led to her being championed in Victorian England. So, for the very reasons why other female authors were being dismissed by Victorian society, Austen was being embraced. Her nephew kickstarted what would become an enduring fandom by securing her reputation through portraying her as an ideal woman. And hopefully you're also noticing that the Victorian era seems to be where a lot of these women whom I'm discussing in this talk, and other women whom I could not fit into this talk due to time constrictions, where their legacies went to die. Before we move forward, wanted to briefly highlight my lovely book photo. This is a biography on Fanny Burney, and it was written by Claire Harmon. Many of you, or some of you, are probably familiar with Claire Harmon because she also has a biography on Jane Austen. She's also written on Charles Dickens, to name a few. This photo is an image of a portable writing desk that Jane Austen would have used, and I took this photo at Chawton House. Anne Radcliffe. So Anne Radcliffe was anything but the ideal woman, by the standards of the critics of her time, at any rate. And on pages 105 and 106 of Jane Austen's bookshelf, Romney had this to say of Radcliffe and Austen. Radcliffe could not escape her own role in the rise of the Gothic. Interestingly, Austen worked in a similarly belittled genre, courtship novels, or what we now call romance, meaning a story about love with a happy ending. But even scholars who are happy to demean the entire genre of romance still allow Austen into the rank of higher literature. She is the best. Radcliffe was the best of her genre too. Ironically, Austen's own parody of Radcliffe's work stuck around much longer than Radcliffe did. So how did the woman Austen coined as the Queen of the Gothics? We got Woolf giving Burney a title. We have Austen giving Radcliffe a title. Queen of Gothics. She coins Radcliffe as Queen of Gothics in Northanger Abbey. How does this woman sink into obscurity? People stopped reading Anne Radcliffe altogether in the wake of a nasty allegation that for several male authors actually resulted in a heightening of fame. Madness. So rumor had it that the very genre she birthed, the terror writing that would go on to inspire authors such as Emily Bronte, Bram Stoker, Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Shelley, that terror writing that she had essentially birthed drove her insane. While questioning the sanity of William Blake and Byron, for example, did not lead to a crippling reputation, it certainly did in the case of Radcliffe. And nobody in the form of either family or critic, unlike Austen's family, not that Austen was ever accused of being insane, but nobody from Radcliffe's family stepped forward to champion her. And the reason for this, most likely, is that Anne Radcliffe was a very private person, which also ties into why we have such little biographical information on Anne Radcliffe. And so it kind of becomes what dooms her, what pushes her into obscurity. Her very desire and wish and determination to have privacy, the very fact that we have such little information on her is basically what allows society to get away with pushing her out of the canon. She disliked attention, and she really had gotten into Gothic writing literally to pass the time, while her husband, who was a parliamentary reporter, was off working, trying to establish himself. She had grown up with this rich education in art history and architectural history, and she kind of put those two together to help inspire her writing. Radcliffe was superb at getting the atmospheric backdrop for her horror writing just right. The Mysteries of Udolpho, arguably her most famous work, was a masterful depiction of architectural terror, the epitome of slow burn writing. This novel created an entire marketplace for Gothic fiction. Radcliffe didn't invent the genre, but she's the reason why it became popular, which is often why we kind of, in this literary world of sleuthing, would consider her to have really kind of birthed what moves forward into eventual popularity. But again, as I mentioned, she was a very private person who disliked public attention, which likely led to her retiring altogether upon the publication of her fifth novel. She didn't die, which was another rumor that was spread. She did not go mad. She moved to the English countryside, where she spent her time when she wasn't traveling with her husband. The public could not and did not accept such a simple explanation. Instead, declarations for insanity persisted and eventually gave way to something perhaps even worse in the eyes of a published novelist. Her writing was determined to be plain and simple bad. So, pausing here again briefly, Queen of Gothics, coined by Austen. Austen very much admired Radcliffe's work. Mysteries of Udolpho is directly referenced in Northanger Abbey. We have our central characters really quite obsessed with the terror of Udolpho, um, the brutal elements of Udolpho. Such a huge influence on Northanger Abbey. And yet, Mysteries of Udolpho is not part of the immediate literary canon. One explanation beyond what I just told you is, if you recall a little bit earlier, I talked about Udolpho being a slow burn. It could be almost too slow of a burn, and the degree of descriptiveness that is incorporated into Udolpho can sometimes be a little bit difficult to stomach because it just goes on. The plot is not as fast paced as an Austen novel, for example. Certainly does not merit her being erased from the canon. Certainly does not qualify her to be considered a bad writer. So before we move into reminding ourselves of this common thread, of Austen not being the one to come under fire, these women coming under fire. Really quickly, this photo, image of a writing desk at the Jane Austen House Museum. Yes, that is my hand. I did buy the Jane Austen ring, could not buy the Jane Austen ring when in Chawton, as one might say. So that is that photo. But let's look at this common thread, right? So connecting to the common thread of Austen not coming under fire, Radcliffe, Lennox, Burney, Edgeworth, to name a few, uh, coming under fire, we also cannot avoid this common thread of the critics really driving the narrative. So the way in which critics discussed and categorized these female novelists really determined how their legacy was shaped, and additionally resulted in their absence from the literary canon. If nobody is reading your work, it's impossible to remain relevant. By contrast, Austen kept being read, right? Becoming even more popular after her death. Where her novels are taught, her novels are book club selections, her novels have been turned into films, her novels have led to the creation of entire society, the Jane Austen Society, established in the 1930s. We attend conferences like this. I don't know about you, but I personally read Austen's books once a year, every year, and I get something different out of her novels every time I read them. There's fan fiction, there's historical fiction, there's so many creations that have spun off of a love, adoration, respect, even hatred of Jane Austen, right? Even people who don't care for her. She's still inspiring dialogue, conversation, creativity. This is not the fate of Lennox, Burney, Radcliffe, or the final female author that we'll be focusing on today, Maria Edgeworth? Perhaps it should have been. So really cannot ignore Austen Lee, who kind of plays that significant role in kickstarting what becomes an entire movement, right? His memoir, which I have read, maybe some of you have read, definitely not my most favorite nonfiction work on Jane Austen. But it is interesting because it's written by a family member, right? But he really in this memoir ensures that critics viewed Austen as an ideal woman, leading to her legacy remaining intact, resulting in a growing fandom that endured, right? He ensures that she is allowed to be continued to be read, essentially. The Victorian era does not cancel Jane Austen. The way that it does with some of the other female authors that we've discussed and not discussed. This is a photo of the circus in Bath, England, turned black and white. So, Maria Edgeworth. And I guess I will stick with discussing images for a moment. This very complex photo. No, this is a shot of Maria Edgeworth's Belinda. My copy of Belinda. Sorry, the cat feeder just went off. That I took on one of my shelves. So, Maria Edgeworth. In a letter to Anna Austen on September 28th, 1814, Austen wrote to her niece, I have made up my mind to like no novels really, but Miss Edgeworth's, yours, and my own. Perhaps some of you are familiar with the fact that Austen's niece, Anna Austen, was also a writer, not someone who's part of the canon, not someone who made it nearly as successfully as Burney or Edgeworth or Radcliffe. But she was a female writer and was inspired by her Aunt Jane and probably also inspired by some of the writers that we're discussing in this talk. So, as I said, she writes to her niece that she loves Edgeworth's novels. For much of the 19th century, Austen and Edgeworth were often discussed together. Might surprise some of you, especially since I would consider Maria Edgeworth, out of all of the authors we've talked about today, to probably be the one that you would maybe be least likely to have heard of before today's talk. The origin of the realistic fiction genre can be traced back to Edgeworth, but it is Austen who would become the realist writer, kind of like how it's Austen who becomes the ideal woman in relation to Frances Burney. So, well, what happened? Well, during the period when Jane Austen was trying to get her feet off the ground in the publishing world, Edgeworth was already a well-established novelist. Her writing was both respected and popular, and she also happened to be another one of Austen's favorite authors. Maria Edgeworth was the type of writer Austen wanted to be, and it was likely the creative genius Edgeworth deployed in her novel Belinda to circumvent the heroine problem that inspired Austen's own heroine in the novel Emma. The heroine problem was as follows. A heroine has to experience something incredible to hold the reader's interest. She needed to have adventures. But the problem was in the era Edgeworth and Austen were writing in, having adventures, if you were a woman, was really just a fancy way of saying illicit liaisons. I.e., the reason why heroines like Lennox's Arabella were frowned upon. In Belinda, Edgeworth worked around this by providing the reader with my cat. Sorry, guys. Just Gizmo, the cat. Right. In Belinda, Edgeworth works around this by providing the reader with a perfect heroine who just so happened to have a mesmerizingly imperfect, constant companion by the name of Lady Delacour. Wise, witty, and bold, Lady Delacour reigns supreme over the London social scene and has all of the adventures that Belinda can. So Austen experimented with the heroine problem, but in an entirely different manner. And arguably, perhaps in a bolder manner, because in her creation of Emma Woodhouse, Belinda's Lady Delacour becomes the leading lady of the novel. This was definitely a risk, which is perhaps why Austen is well known for declaring that she created a heroine perhaps only herself would end up liking. Lady Delacour and Emma share both personality traits and certain plot lines. So, for example, conflict occurs as a direct result of mistakes they make concerning their friendship with naive Belindas and Harriets of the world. A copy of Emma, at Jane Austen's own request, was sent to Maria Edgeworth as a gesture of literary kinship. It would be incorrect, though, to view Emma as a carbon copy of Belinda, just as it would be incorrect to view Northanger Abbey as a carbon copy of the writing styles of Radcliffe or Lennox or Burney, right? As Romney says of the two novels on page 21 of Jane Austen's bookshelf, reading the two together feels something like a jazz session. One author tries out a melody, the other listens and plays back, building their own unique deviations and flourishes. So we return again to the question of why, when we talk about Austen today, we don't often bring Edgeworth into conversation. When Austen Leigh's memoir was published in 1870, Austen and Edgeworth were both already deceased, and a shift occurred. Suddenly, Edgeworth was coined an Irish novelist, and her works became considered regional. Sketches of a nationality that readers in London would have viewed as remote, simplistic, perhaps even. And nobody really brought up Belinda anymore. Instead, Edgeworth's name was linked with the novels she'd set in Ireland, such as The Absentee. So even though Edgeworth would certainly have been, a qualifier to be considered a realist writer, she becomes labeled a regional writer, an Irish regional writer to boot, which essentially seals kind of her fate where the literary canon is concerned. And Austen sort of steps into, posthumously, of course, steps into that category of the realist writer. Edgeworth sort of disappears from the canon, and meanwhile, Austen is viewed as universal. Her works become viewed as superior to that of a regional writer, superior to that of Edgeworth. And once again, we bring up the name Austen Leigh. He pays homage in his memoir of his aunt to Jane Austen's love of Richardson, but he makes no mention of her love for Burney, no mention of her love for Edgeworth. So instead of being a writer who made something of herself within a larger literary conversation, Austen resurfaces posthumously as this kind of lone genius in her corner of the literary canon. And Romney, on page 78 of Jane Austen's bookshelf, says Austen never viewed herself as the lone great woman writer of her era. And we are so lucky, we are so fortunate, albeit we don't have the whole kitchen caboodle, but we're so fortunate to have evidence that Austen didn't think that way because we have some of her letters. And there has just been so much biographical research on her. sorry, very quickly. This is a Castle Rackrent and Ennui. So these would be more examples of Edgeworth's regional Irish novelist writings. Really wonderful read, highly recommend. This brings us to the Jane Austen's Shelves Challenge. In my opinion, there is an undeniable ease to Austen's style, right? The purpose of this presentation is not to say that Jane Austen is not great, because she is. I will forever love her. She will forever be my favorite writer. She writes with confidence. She genuinely seems to be in complete control of her art. Today, we celebrate Jane Austen for her masterful depiction of the everyday, her ability to craft witty dialogue and create captivating storylines that feel relatable, the realist writer, the satirical writer, the romance writer. The themes of her novels, the ambition of her characters, the desire to be loved and not judged, there's just this relatability to her books, regardless of the period they're set in. They're timeless. I think so anyway. And like so many other writers who came before her and who have come after her, Austen wrote what she knew and was influenced by what she read. That's part of the point of this talk, to think about where the inspiration for her novels came from. It's really easy for us to focus on the inspiration that would have come from her own everyday life, right? But it's also important to think about what she was reading, how she was interacting with what she was reading, and how what she was reading might have or did influence what she was writing. Austen did not see herself as a pioneer. She didn't consider herself the only one. So, unlike Radcliffe, and in spite of Austen's sister Cassandra Burning's select correspondence, we do have evidence of the writers Austen was inspired by, as I mentioned on the previous slide. And while that isn't meant to serve as proof that Austen was the inferior writer by any means, it should serve as proof that she was not the superior. Lennox, Burney, Radcliffe, Edgeworth were all featured authors on Austen's shelves. And in the spirit of our mutual love for Jane Austen, I issue this challenge to you all. If these women all had books on the shelves of our favorite writer or one of our favorite writers, shouldn't they be on your shelves too? So, this is a picture of Chawton House. This is a very abbreviated list because it's a slide of just some books that are 100% worth checking out. Jane Austen's bookshelf, first and foremost, where you'll also get exposure to a handful of female writers I did not have time to highlight in depth in this talk. Belinda by Maria Edgeworth, Evelina by Frances Burney, Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe, Female Quixote by Charlotte Lennox, Biography by Claire Harmon on Fanny Burney, just a few to get going. And so I want to say thank you so much for your time and attention today. I love Jane Austen. I love her dearly. I am always up for talking about her. I also am obsessed with reading literature. It's why I'm here. It's what I do for a living. So if any of you would like to engage with me further about Jane Austen or about books in general or about this talk, if you have any questions, if you have any opinions, if you've read some of the works of these authors that I talked about in this presentation and you want to just have some book talk, you can always find me in the book corner of Instagram. My handle is at Musings of the Well-Read. Please feel free to reach out, to send a direct message, to a friend request, whatever you're feeling up up for. Again, thank you so much for your attention today. I've really enjoyed speaking with you. It's been an incredible opportunity, a fun experience, and hopefully you enjoyed it and did not mind the brief interruption from the cat, Gizmo. Have a fabulous rest of your day. Thank you so much for your time and attention.